Not only am I going to be ranking the best wide receiver pickups for you this week, but I'm also going to be telling you who you can drop a wide receiver to make some space on your team. And also, we're going to do the same thing at tight end, because I understand while the elite tight ends have been absolutely garbage this season, there are actually a few interesting waiver wire pickups that you can look at. Now, let's go ahead and let's start at the wide receivers that you can drop. I know some people were maybe holding off some hope for Jalen McMillan, the rookie wide receiver in Tampa. But to be honest with you, if we're looking at the involvement that you have from Chris Godwin, primarily as the slot receiver here, and pretty much every target in this offense being funneled through Godwin and Evans through the first 3 weeks, was sprinkled in with some Cade Otton, who we'll talk about later in this video. Really, there's no path for Jalen McMillan to actually be viable in fantasy this season. Definitely still a wide receiver that has some upside long-term for dynasty fantasy football purposes. There's just no upside this year. And there's also no upside whatsoever with any Denver Broncos wide receiver not named Courtland Sutton. If you're rostering Marvin Mims, I don't know why. If you're rostering Troy Frank, if you're rostering anybody but Sutton this offense, it's time to move on. If you're looking at the passing volume that you've had here with Bo Nix, we are through 3 weeks now. Bo Nix is yet to give you a single passing touchdown in this offense, and Bo Nix is averaging a little under 200 passing yards per game. So, yep, you can just go ahead. You hold on to Sutton just because you've had the target volume, but everybody else is easy to let go of. Jalen Tolbert is kind of in a similar situation in that, while Tolbert was a waiver wire pickup for us last week, now that you have Jake Ferguson coming in the expansion of the amount of players that are actually touching the football in this Dallas Cowboys offense, it is very easy to go ahead and say, okay, Tolbert as presumably the fourth option in a passing offense that hasn't been great, is a player that you can send to the waiver wire, rostered in 11% of leagues. And I understand, yes, I told you to go ahead and pick him up last week, but I'm going to be the first person to take my L, right? I'm going to be the first person to say, okay, yep, I know what I said. I was wrong. Let's move on. Let's not just clog a roster spot for no reason. Like, looking at the amount of players that touched the football in Dallas this past week, you had Rico Dowdle, Ezekiel Elliott, Deuce Vaughn, Kavontae Turpin, Jake Ferguson, CeeDee Lamb, Jalen Tolbert, Hunter Lupke, Jalen Brooks, Brandon Cooks, Luke Schoonmaker, and Tyler Smith. You had 17 players touching the ball for the Dallas Cowboys this week. There's no way in that environment Jalen Tolbert makes a difference. Now, going over to the next drop, Curtis Samuel, we can go ahead and we can let go of. Now, Samuel was someone I was low on in drafts, but honestly, I was giving him the benefit of the doubt through the first few weeks. The reason being is, if you were looking at Samuel, this is a wide receiver that was dealing with the turf toe coming into the season. So I thought maybe seeing him only play 27% of the snaps week 1, seeing him only play 27% of the snaps week 2, we were just going to need him to be fully, well, at this point, it looks like Curtis Samuel is not going to be anything. Khalil Shakir has really cemented himself as the wide receiver 1 in this offense in the short term. And if we're going to be betting on a wide receiver 1 in the long term, I'd way rather bet on Keon Coleman, who is flash and is extremely young, not the 28-year-old wide receiver that has one season in his NFL career with over 9.0 fantasy points per game. Now, going over to a receiver that actually had a touchdown this past week, and I know maybe some people are going to be looking to pick him up off the waiver wire. Jalen Naylor, you can go ahead and you can let go of him. It does sound like Jordan Addison's day-to-day, and there's a good shot that Jordan Addison's coming back this next week. And while I understand Naylor, he's had a touchdown every single week through the first 3 here. Once you have Jefferson fully healthy, once you have Addison fully healthy, and TJ Hawkinson's return is on the horizon, there's really no upside in going through and trying to bet on the fourth option in a passing offense for Sam Darnold that really has never done anything. He's 25 years old. We're not expecting a massive breakout at this point. And then somebody that I was also holding off some hope for was Adonai Mitchell. If you're looking at Mitchell, he played 64% of the snaps in week 1. That goes down to 59% in week 2. And in week 3, you're at 13%. Yes, 13% of the snaps for Adonai Mitchell, where ultimately Josh Downs coming into this offense, Alec Pierce really emerging as one of the top options for Anthony Richardson, makes it where AD Mitchell is really not a player that we're going to be looking at until 2025 from a dynasty fantasy football perspective. But let's go ahead and let's get into the most interesting waiver wire pickups in your league this week. Starting with the most interesting, Jawan Jennings. Now, with Jennings, I'm going to be honest with you, I could have never expected or never projected for him to come out and drop 47 fantasy points this week against the Rams. absurd. I thought Ayuk was going to have himself a massive day with no Debo, with no Kittle. You have 12 targets for Jennings, 175 receiving yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns. Now, going through the rest of the year, do I expect Juwan Jennings to be a wide receiver that all of a sudden wins you a league down the stretch? Not at all. Debo Samuel will be back. George Kittle will be back. Ricky Pearsall will be back, who they just took in round 1 of the NFL draft. They just gave Brandon Ayuk $120 million. So to be honest with you, long-term, Jennings is not a startable receiver. However, in the short term, it doesn't matter. Because if Debo does not play this next week, if George Kittle does not play this next week, I know some of y'all are sitting here with absolutely loaded teams. Trust me, I wish I had one. But if you don't have a loaded team, you're going to be going through and looking at Jennings as a very clear flex play, as probably a high-end wide receiver too in the environment with no Debo and with no Kittle. You're going up against the New England Patriots, so maybe one of the issues you're going to have is this is a 10-point spread. The Niners really aren't going to have to throw the ball in the second half. But at the same time, there was a massive spread of this game against the Rams, and you kind of thought the same thing in week 3. Now, going over to somebody that I took in a ridiculous amount of underdog best ball drafts that I thought could maybe give us some random upside later in the year, but in a regular redraft league wouldn't make a difference. It looks like Xavier Legette, currently rostered in 35% of leagues, is actually a receiver that has upside rest of season now. The reason being is, one, this offense does not look like a JV football team anymore with Andy Dalton under center. Now, full transparency, I do expect that you probably have this offense coming back down to earth just a bit this next week. Like, if we are coming up with some realistic expectations, at home, they are about 4.5-point dogs going up against the Cincinnati Bengals. So yes, I think that everybody is expecting Carolina to be worse in the future than they were in week 3. But at the same time, they're probably going to be a hell of a lot better than they were in week 2. And if you're looking at this Panthers receiver room with the injury to Adam Thielen, all of a sudden we should expect that Legette's snap rate dramatically goes up. He played 59% of the snaps in both weeks 1 and 3. He only played 42% of the snaps in week 2. But if we all of a sudden see an 80% route participation rate for a wide receiver that was just selected in round 1 of the NFL draft, where Deontay Johnson obviously crushes, like, I don't want to overlook Deontay. I will say, of course, we updated our rankings over on flogfantasy.com. Over there, I did move Deontay Johnson up to being wide receiver 31, which I know sounds low, but I mean, he's in the same range as Roma Dunze, Tank Dell, Xavier Worthy, Jackson Smith and Jigba. There's just a lot of very exciting receivers. And I think Deontay is kind of a lock for your flex at this point, but I wouldn't be surprised if Legette is able to see 20-25% of the targets in this offense. So I actually moved Xavier Legette up to wide receiver 59 in my ranks. And to be honest with you, he's probably going to be jumping Joshua Palmer. He may jump Brandon Cooks. He may jump Gabe Davis. He's probably going to move up to about the Tyler Lockett range in these rankings. And of course, if you ever wanted to check out the rankings on flogfantasy.com, the expert rankings are free. The trade calculator is free. The trade calculator, you can put in your exact league settings. And with those league settings, we can actually use an algorithm to determine what side of the trade is the best for you. And on top of that, you can actually link your fantasy football league where you can see power rankings based off the overall value of each roster. So definitely make sure you take advantage of that over on flogfantasy.com. All of that is free. You can find the link in the description. You can find the link in the comment section as well. I mean, I would say that these free tools are stuff that you should be pretty much using every single day, especially as you submit your starting lineups. Now, going over to our next pickup, Josh Downs is the third most appealing wide receiver ad this week. If you are looking at Josh Downs, I was surprised to see the involvement that he had his first week in here. Like we said, Adonai Mitchell was somebody that you could go ahead and drop primarily because the Josh Downs usage, where Josh Downs comes out and he actually ties Michael Pittman Jr. for the team lead in 5 targets this week. Now, am I going to come out and say that Josh Downs is all of a sudden a wide receiver that you have to? No, of course, I don't think you have to start Josh Downs, but ultimately he was a very strong prospect. He had a decent rookie season. Going into year 2, we expect that natural leap. And I think I would prefer him over some of these names like Curtis Samuel at this point, where we're going to take the bet on the young ascending player rather than the older descending option. Now, Wan'Dale Robinson will be our next receiver here. If you are looking at Wan'Dale, I know we had him as a must-add guy after week 1. Then we had him as a drop after week 2. I'm sorry to keep flip-flopping this, but this is fantasy football, right? I mean, I, with my own team, send players to the waiver wire, pick them back up, send them to the waiver wire, pick them back up. Here, the main reason for this is I'm starting to think, what if Daniel Jones isn't horrible? Which I don't want to come out and overreact and say, oh, Daniel Jones is good all of a sudden, but what if Daniel Jones isn't one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL? And Wan'Dale Robinson is now seeing 8 targets a game. Malik Neighbors is absolutely dominant. We can expect that Neighbors is going to get a ton of defensive attention going into the future. So I think Wan'Dale could be a viable pickup if you are desperate for a play during the bye weeks in your flex. Now, Ricky Pearsall will be a wide receiver that I am now really looking at. Obviously, it's going to depend on your league settings if he's rostered or not. If your league mates were able to pick him up, then throw him on the IR, then I'm sure he's already sitting on somebody's IR. But I want you to be adding him to your watch list because it does seem like he will be back in week 5. This is currently a team that's dealing with the Christian McCaffrey injury. It's currently a team dealing with the Deebo Samuel injury. This is currently a team dealing with the George Kittle injury. And Ricky Pearsall is actually a wide receiver that was selected in round 1 of the NFL draft. He's already 24 years old. You're going to assume that this is a player that's maybe a little more pro ready than what we have seen with those 20-year-olds coming in. And also at the same time, we know that we have the history with Kyle Shanahan with his rookie wide receivers, getting them involved immediately. Now, the Shanahan blueprint is, let's get this guy involved right away as a rookie. We'll throw him in the doghouse in week 2 for God knows what reason. And then he'll be right back to being our guy in year 3. So I think Ricky is definitely worth that pickup, just given the amount of injuries that you have in San Francisco. And he may be coming back, not this week, but next. Michael Wilson is an okay pickup, rostered in 13% of leagues. The thing with Michael Wilson is if you were to see an injury to Trey McBride, instead of the next tight end stepping into this offense here in Arizona, I actually would expect that Michael Wilson would get the majority of that target volume. You actually had 90% of the snaps played for Wilson this past week, and he sees a season high of 9 targets. And a lot of this has to do with no Trey McBride. These secondary receivers in Arizona are going to get a decent amount of work. Tutu Atwell will be our next guy in here at 7. Tutu Atwell looks like he may have all along been the Los Angeles Rams receiver that you wanted. We actually see 74% of the routes run in week 3, which is obviously a lot higher than what we had on week 2 with 19%. Tutu Atwell is actually still very young. He's only 24 years old. Obviously, he's been in the NFL for quite some time. You can go back to 2023 when you had some pretty decent weeks. I mean, remember to start the year in 2023, you had a performance of 18 points, then 15 points, then 18 points from Atwell. Obviously, a little more boom, a bust type player. I will say, if you're looking at sportsbook projections, they do have the Rams as a pretty low scoring offense this week, which does make sense with all the injuries this team's dealing with. And then Trey Tucker is only rostered in 3% of leagues. I just wanted to include him on this list to say, don't go out there and just chase the 22 points. Yes, if it was a best ball league and you could randomly get these spikes into your starting lineup, then cool, sure, we take them. I don't really want to waste your time talking about him. I just figured that he was probably going to be in some other waiver wire videos this week, and I wanted to put my stance on it. I don't think he's worth a pickup. I don't think you're ever going to be able to predict when he would produce. Now, going over to the tight end position, here we are to save you. And I took Sam Laporta in the Flock League, so I'm not going to lie, I will be submitting some fab bids for some of these tight ends this week. But first, the tight ends that you can drop. Greg Dulcich going to be an easy drop after this past week, going back to what we had with everybody's a drop, but Courtland Sutton in Denver. He had 67% of the snaps in week 1, 54% of the snaps in week 2, down to only 25% of the snaps in week 3, and he had 8 targets in week 2, but nothing in week 3. Jonnu Smith, very easy drop as well. Jonnu Smith was already a part-time tight end, hasn't played a game with over 50% of the snaps all year. Well, yeah, in week 2, he had 7 targets for 6 receptions, so he had a decent amount of volume. At the same time, it's going to be a horrible offense, so there's just simply no upside. Juwan Johnson's going to be a drop. I mean, if you are looking at Juwan, if you were thinking that he was going to do anything, it'd be in a game with no Taysom Hill. So all of a sudden, maybe he's involved in the red zone. No, through 3 games, he has a total of 3 targets. Yes, one of them came in for a touchdown, but Juwan Johnson, definitely not worth the raw spot at this point. Now we're going to look at Chig for the next tight end here in Tennessee. Tennessee actually spread the ball around to a ton of different players here this past week. But at the same time, it's going to be a low volume passing attack. DeAndre Hopkins is actually stepping his role up. And with Chig, you've had 3 straight games now with fewer than 20 receiving yards. And then Ben Sinnott will be our last tight ends here. With Sinnott, I understand that some people drafted him thinking that he was going to have a ceiling, and that appears to just not be the case. With Zach Ertz officially being the tight end in Washington. Even if this Washington offense is looking great, Ben Sinnott has not had a single reception this year. I think you are just wasting a roster spot on him, to be honest. Now, going over and picking up some tight ends. Obviously, I don't want to be saying all this out loud just because I know some of the people who are in the Flock League are going to watch this, including Thomas, the guy editing it right now. But anyway, Pat Frymuth is currently on the waiver wire in the Flock League. Your boy will be looking to pick him up as we are dealing with the Sam Laporta injury. Now, Frymuth may not be available in your league as Frymuth is rostered in 67% of sleeper leagues at the moment. But if you're looking at the underlying usage, it has been very consistent with Frymuth. If you're just looking at the basic box score, where Pat Frymuth's had 4 targets, 4 targets, 5 targets, 4 receptions each of the first 3 games. But if you're looking at the snap rate, you actually had Frymuth up at 81% of the snaps this past week, and Darnell Washington actually slid backwards, which would be very promising for Frymuth going into the future. Pulling up my updated tight end rankings on flockfantasy.com, I will most likely be sliding Pat Frymuth up to about tight end 17 in our rest of season ranks. It is very sad looking at the photo of Pat Frymuth, where he's 25 years old and he looks like a grown man while I still look like a little balding boy. But anyway, going over to our next tight end, somebody that's the snap rate takes a massive step forward with. Cole Kmet only played 48% of the snaps in week 1. That jumps to 77% of the snaps in week 2. That jumps to 81% of the snaps in week 3. Gerald Everett is no longer something that you have to be worried about in this offense. Kmet drops 26 fantasy points this week. Now, yes, you have Caleb dropping back to pass a ton. Now, yes, you also have no Keenan Allen. So when the passing volume comes down in Chicago and Keenan Allen comes back in, are we expecting Cole Kmet to continue to drop 20 points? Of course not. But I mean, all we really need for Cole Kmet is to give us 8 fantasy points at tight end. And if you give me 8 fantasy points at tight end this season, I am thanking God for it. Now let's move over to Zach Ertz. Yeah, Zach Ertz has cemented himself in what appears to be an extremely strong offense going into the future. I mean, Zach Ertz has had a total of 13 targets through the first 3 weeks. He has had a total of 12 receptions. And at the same time, he's actually near the top of the NFL at the tight end position in total receiving yards, which is extremely surprising for the 33-year-old tight end. And I don't know if I'm going through like a quarter life crisis right now, because I thought Zach Ertz was so old. I hear 33 years old. I'm like, oh, that's not that old. But obviously for football purposes, it is. But nonetheless, I mean, he has been seeing target volume. At the same time, this Washington offense is much better than everybody, including myself, was expecting. And it looks like Ben Sinnott is just absolutely nothing here. Ertz only rostered in 30% of leagues. Cade Otton will be somebody that I want to give a shout out to. Cade Otton only negative 0.4 points last week. But this week, you actually get the 8 targets for 7 receptions. Not super excited about him. The snap rate's always going to be there for Cade Otton. The issue is the vast majority of the targets are going to go to Evans and Godwin. I may end up actually moving Tyler Conklin ahead of Cade Otton. I mean, with Conklin, you have the snap rate extremely high as well. I mean, 3 straight weeks now with over 90%. But at the same time, just really took the matchup against the Patriots to get him involved. And then Noah Fant will also be a viable pickup at tight ends. What's actually interesting is Noah Fant has the best game of his season if you're looking at his fantasy points with a total of 12. But he actually only plays 44% of the snaps here in Seattle. And you're seeing more and more 3 wide receiver sets. You're seeing more and more Jackson Smith and Jigba at the same time. So that's why even though Noah Fant has the best name appeal, I want to say is the most exciting name on the list, is going to be lower down because of the usage with the smaller role in this offense. But I think that's all I have for you. I really hope that we were able to help you out. And I do want to reiterate, please take advantage of all those free tools that I built out over on flockfantasy.com for y'all. I mean, you can use the league rankings, just sync your team. We sync with ESPN, Sleeper, Yahoo. You can go ahead and you can check out all the expert rankings for free. Dynasty, redraft, weekly. You can go ahead and use the trade calculator for free. Use the trade finder for free. And yeah, you can find the link to flockfantasy.com in both the description as well as the comment section of this video. But I really do appreciate you, and I really hope I actually get to check out your fantasy football team in the live stream later tonight.